Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. I have served as a Catholic priest for 23 years, ministering to congregations in 3 different parishes across the Midwest. In that time, I have heard thousands of confessions, counseled families through unimaginable grief, performed last rites for the dying, and witnessed both the profound faith and devastating doubts that define the human spiritual experience. I thought I understood the nature of evil, the weight of sin, and the boundaries between psychological suffering and something darker. My name is Father Gregory Walsh, and what I am about to document occurred during my tenure at St. Augustine's Parish in Cedar Falls, Iowa, beginning in the spring of 2021. The case involved a confession that challenged everything I believed about the seal of the confessional, the nature of evil, and the terrible choices that define our humanity. St. Augustine's is a modest parish serving a community of about 1,200 families in a college town dominated by the University of Northern Iowa. The congregation is a typical mix of longtime residents, university faculty, and young families drawn to the area's excellent schools and safe neighborhoods. For 8 years, I had served this community through baptisms, weddings, funerals, and the ordinary spiritual needs that define parish life. The confessional at St. Augustine's is traditional in design, a small wooden booth divided into 2 sections by a latticed screen that allows the penitent to remain anonymous while confessing their sins. This anonymity is sacred in Catholic tradition, protected by the seal of confession, which forbids a priest from ever revealing what is said during the sacrament under any circumstances, including threats of imprisonment or death. In 23 years of hearing confessions, I had maintained this seal without exception. I had heard admissions of adultery, theft, violence, and every manner of human failing, and I had never broken the sacred trust that allows Catholics to confess their darkest secrets without fear of exposure. The seal of confession is absolute, considered inviolable by canon law and protected by law in most U.S. states as privileged communication. On Saturday, April 17, 2021, a man entered the confessional during our scheduled confession hours between 3 and 5 p.m. I did not recognize his voice, which was not unusual. Many parishioners preferred the anonymity of confession, and some only attended the sacrament occasionally. The man's voice was calm, educated, and deliberate in a way that suggested careful consideration of his words. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," he began, using the traditional opening. "It has been 6 months since my last confession." I responded with the customary invitation to confess his sins, expecting to hear the typical catalog of minor transgressions: impatience with family members, uncharitable thoughts, missed prayers, or moral failings that trouble the conscience but represent the ordinary struggles of spiritual life. What he said instead was, "Father, I have killed 3 people, and I am going to kill again." The words hung in the air of the confessional booth, so shocking that for several seconds I could not formulate a response. In 23 years of ministry, I had heard confessions of many serious sins, but I had never heard someone calmly admit to multiple murders and announce their intention to commit more. "My son," I finally managed, "what you're telling me is extremely serious. Are you speaking literally or metaphorically about some spiritual death or harm you've caused?" "I'm speaking literally, Father," he replied, his voice still unnaturally calm. "I have taken 3 lives over the past 14 months, 2 women and 1 man, and I have identified my next victim. My training as a priest had included scenarios involving serious sins revealed in confession, including theoretical discussions of how to counsel someone who confessed to crimes. But the academic discussions in seminary bore no resemblance to the reality of sitting in a confessional booth with someone calmly describing murders they had committed. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, struggling to maintain the pastoral tone expected during confession while my mind raced through the implications of what I was hearing. "Because I need absolution, Father. I know what I'm doing is wrong. I feel the weight of these sins on my soul, but I can't stop. I have tried to resist, but the compulsion is too strong. I confess these sins sincerely, and I ask for God's forgiveness." The theological complexity of this confession was staggering. True contrition, genuine sorrow for sin, and resolution to avoid it in the future is necessary for valid absolution. Could someone who openly stated they would kill again be truly contrite? Could I, as a priest, grant absolution to someone who was confessing sins they had already decided to repeat? "My son," I said carefully, "true contrition requires a firm purpose of amendment, a genuine intention to avoid the sin in the future. If you're telling me you intend to kill again, I cannot grant you absolution." "I understand the doctrine, Father," he replied, "but I'm not sure that doctrine accounts for my situation. I don't want to kill. I genuinely wish I could stop, but I know with absolute certainty that I will kill again because the compulsion is beyond my control. Does my lack of control mean I lack free will? And if I lack free will, am I truly sinning?" This was not the rambling of a disturbed mind, but a carefully reasoned theological argument that suggested education and intelligence. The man was engaging with concepts of moral agency, compulsion, and sin in ways that indicated he had given serious thought to his actions from a religious perspective. "The Church teaches that culpability for sin can be diminished by factors that reduce freedom," I responded, drawing on my theological training. "But diminished culpability is not the same as no culpability. If you have the capacity to seek help, to confess your actions to authorities, to take steps to prevent future harm, then you retain moral agency and responsibility." "But Father, that's exactly why I'm here. I'm taking the step I believe God requires, confessing my sins and seeking forgiveness. The seal of confession means you cannot tell anyone what I've told you. So this confession represents my attempt at spiritual remedy without causing earthly consequences that would prevent me from continuing my work." The calculated nature of this statement chilled me. He was using the seal of confession as a shield, knowing that I could not report his crimes or warn his intended victim without violating the sacred trust that defines the sacrament. "What you're describing isn't seeking remedy," I said, my voice harder than I had intended. "You're using the confessional as a place to unburden your conscience while planning to continue harming others. That's not repentance, that's manipulation." "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "but it's also confession. And according to canon law, you must maintain the seal regardless of what I tell you or why I'm telling you. You cannot refuse me the sacrament simply because you disapprove of my motivations." He was correct about the law. The seal of confession is absolute under canon law, and a priest cannot refuse confession based on doubts about the penitent's sincerity without violating the sacrament's essential nature. But every instinct I possessed as a human being was screaming that this situation transcended religious law and required action to prevent imminent harm. "Tell me about the people you killed," I said, trying to gather information that might somehow be useful despite the restrictions of the seal. "Help me understand what led you to these actions." Over the next 40 minutes, the man described 3 murders in disturbing detail. The first victim was a 32-year-old woman named Angela Hoffman, a social worker who had been found dead in her apartment in January 2020. Her death had been ruled a suicide. She had apparently taken an overdose of sleeping pills and left a note apologizing to her family for her depression. "But it wasn't suicide," the man explained. "I gained her trust over several weeks, learned about her struggles with depression, and then used that knowledge to stage her death in a way that would appear self-inflicted. The sleeping pills were administered while she was already unconscious from a sedative I gave her. The suicide note was written by me, carefully matching her handwriting style from documents I had access to." The second victim was 45-year-old Harold Brennan, a high school teacher who had died in a single car accident in August 2020. According to the confession, Brennan's death had also been carefully orchestrated to appear accidental. He had a known heart condition, the man said. I induced a cardiac episode while he was driving on a rural road. The subsequent crash was attributed to his heart failure, and no autopsy was performed because his medical history provided an obvious explanation. The third victim was 28-year-old Rachel Foster, a graduate student at the university who had drowned in the Cedar River in November 2020. She was an experienced swimmer, the man noted, but even experienced swimmers can drown in cold water if they're incapacitated first. Her death was ruled an accidental drowning, possibly complicated by alcohol consumption, though the alcohol was introduced post-mortem. The level of planning and sophistication in these murders was terrifying. This was not impulsive violence or crimes of passion, but carefully calculated killings designed to avoid detection by appearing as suicide, accident, or natural death. Why are you killing these people? I asked. What connects them? That's the interesting question, Father. From an outside perspective, they appear to have nothing in common. Different ages, different occupations, different social circles. But they do share one connection. They all knew something about me that represented a threat. What kind of threat? That's not something I can explain while maintaining my anonymity in this confessional. But I can tell you that each of them discovered information that could have destroyed my life if revealed. I didn't kill them out of malice or pleasure, but out of necessity. They were threats that needed to be eliminated. This explanation revealed something crucial about the killer's psychology. He saw his murders not as evil acts, but as rational solutions to problems. The victims weren't human beings with inherent worth and dignity, but threats to be neutralized through calculated violence. And your next intended victim? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Her name is Claire Montgomery. She's a 34-year-old forensic accountant who is getting dangerously close to uncovering information that would expose me. I've been monitoring her investigation for several weeks, and I've concluded that she needs to be eliminated within the next month before her findings become public. The fact that he named his intended victim suggested either supreme confidence in the seal of confession or a desire to test whether I would break that seal to save her life. Either way, I now possessed information about a specific, imminent threat to an identifiable person, but I was bound by sacred vow and canon law never to reveal what I had heard. You need to turn yourself in to authorities, I said, knowing even as I spoke that the request was futile. What you're doing is evil, regardless of your rationalizations. These are human beings with families, friends, futures that you've destroyed. If you have any conscience at all, you must stop. I told you, Father, I can't stop. And even if I could, why would I? From a purely rational perspective, I'm solving problems that threaten my existence and well-being. Society's rules about not killing are social constructs designed to maintain order, but they don't apply to someone like me who operates outside normal moral frameworks. They're not social constructs, I responded, my voice rising despite my efforts at pastoral calm. They're moral absolutes rooted in the inherent dignity of human life. You're not operating outside moral frameworks. You're committing evil while trying to rationalize it as something else. Evil is a religious concept, Father. From a secular perspective, I'm simply an organism doing what's necessary to survive and thrive. The fact that society labels my actions as wrong doesn't make them inherently evil. It just makes them socially unacceptable. The intellectual detachment with which he discussed murder was perhaps more disturbing than the violence itself. This was not a person struggling with mental illness or uncontrolled rage, but someone who had consciously rejected basic moral principles and was operating according to a cold calculus of self-interest. I cannot grant you absolution, I said firmly. Without true contrition and purpose of amendment, absolution would be invalid and meaningless. I understand, Father, but I've fulfilled my religious obligation by confessing. Whether you grant absolution or not, I've acknowledged my sins to God through His appointed representative. That's all the church requires." He stood to leave the confessional, and I heard the sound of the booth door opening. Before he exited completely, he spoke one final time. "Thank you for listening, Father. I may return to confess again after I deal with Claire Montgomery, unless, of course, you decide to break the seal of confession and warn her, in which case I'll know that I can no longer trust the sacrament." The door closed, and I was left alone in the confessional, bound by sacred vow to remain silent while possessing knowledge of 3 murders and an imminent 4th. The seal of confession, which I had always viewed as a sacred protection for penitents, had become a weapon being used to shield a killer. I sat in the confessional for nearly an hour after he left, wrestling with the impossible moral dilemma he had created. Every instinct I possessed urged me to contact police, to warn Claire Montgomery, to take any action that might prevent another murder. But breaking the seal of confession would violate the most sacred trust in Catholic ministry, and potentially invalidate every confession ever made by any parishioner who trusted in that seal's inviolability. The Church's position on this issue is unambiguous. Canon 983 states, "The sacramental seal is inviolable. Therefore, it is absolutely forbidden for a confessor to betray in any way a penitent in words or in any manner and for any reason." Canon 1388 specifies that a priest who directly violates the seal of confession incurs automatic excommunication. But how could remaining silent be morally acceptable when it meant allowing someone to be murdered? The commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," surely applied to preventing murder through inaction as much as committing murder through action. I spent that evening in prayer, searching for some theological or canonical justification for action that wouldn't require breaking the seal. I considered whether I could warn Claire Montgomery in general terms without revealing specific information from confession. I researched whether the seal applied when the penitent was clearly using confession manipulatively rather than seeking genuine spiritual counsel. I looked for any precedent in church history or moral theology that might provide guidance. What I found was confirmation of what I already knew. The seal is absolute. The Church has consistently held that even to prevent serious harm, even to save lives, even under torture or threat of death, a priest cannot reveal what is heard in confession. The reasoning is that breaking the seal even once would destroy the trust that allows the sacrament to function, potentially preventing countless souls from seeking reconciliation with God. Over the following weeks, I became obsessed with trying to identify the confessor and his intended victim without violating the seal. I searched local news archives for the deaths he had described: Angela Hoffman, Harold Brennan, Rachel Foster. I found obituaries and news articles confirming that all 3 had died in the time frame and manner he described, though in each case, the deaths had been ruled non-suspicious. I tried to locate Claire Montgomery through public records and professional directories, finding several women with that name in the region, but no way to determine which might be the intended victim. Even if I could identify her, what could I say? I couldn't reveal the source of my information without breaking the seal, and a vague warning to be careful based on no stated evidence would likely be dismissed as the ravings of a paranoid priest. The psychological burden of this knowledge became overwhelming. I found myself unable to sleep, constantly reviewing the confession in my mind and searching for some solution that wouldn't require betraying my vows while also preventing murder. I lost weight, neglected my pastoral duties, and withdrew from the daily interactions that normally sustained my ministry. Other priests I consulted, carefully, without revealing details, confirmed that the seal was absolute and that I had no canonical option to intervene. A moral theology professor I contacted through anonymous email stated bluntly, "The seal of confession admits no exceptions. If you possess knowledge solely through confession, you cannot act on that knowledge regardless of the consequences." On May 23, 2021, approximately 5 weeks after the confession, I found a news article about a woman named Claire Montgomery. a 34-year-old forensic accountant who had died in a house fire at her apartment in Waterloo, Iowa, about 20 miles from Cedar Falls. The fire had been attributed to faulty electrical wiring, and her death was ruled accidental. I stared at the article for hours, knowing with moral certainty that this was the victim he had mentioned in confession, and that her death had been murder staged to look accidental, just like the others. I had possessed knowledge that could have saved her life, and I had done nothing because of my vows. The guilt and anguish I felt were beyond anything I had experienced in 23 years of ministry. I had become complicit in murder through my silence, bound by rules that suddenly seemed designed to protect evil rather than facilitate repentance. The theological arguments about the seal's necessity rang hollow when measured against the reality of Claire Montgomery's death and the deaths that would likely follow. In June 2021, I requested a leave of absence from St. Augustine's Parish, citing health concerns. The bishop granted my request, and I spent 3 months in a monastery trying to reconcile what had happened with my understanding of priesthood, moral responsibility, and the nature of God's justice. During those months, I studied every historical case I could find of priests confronting the seal of confession in extreme circumstances. I found stories of priests who maintained the seal even under torture during war, priests who refused to reveal confessions of treason even when thousands of lives were at stake, and the consistent teaching that the seal could never be broken, regardless of consequences. But I also found something else in my research: cases where priests had found creative ways to act on knowledge from confession without technically violating the seal. A priest who heard confession of planned violence might preach a homily about that specific sin, hoping to reach the penitent's conscience. A priest who learned of criminal activity might encourage law enforcement to investigate certain areas without revealing his source. The line between permissible action and seal violation was razor thin, but it existed. When I returned to St. Augustine's in September 2021, I began a careful campaign of indirect action. I preached homilies about the moral responsibility to prevent harm to others, about the corruption of using religious institutions to shield evil, about the difference between genuine repentance and manipulation of sacred practices. I hoped that if the killer returned to confession or attended Mass, these messages might reach his conscience. I also began volunteering as a police chaplain, building relationships with local law enforcement that might allow me to subtly guide investigations without revealing specific information. When conversations turned to unsolved cases or suspicious deaths, I learned to ask questions that might prompt authorities to look more carefully at deaths previously ruled accidental or natural. In December 2021, I received an anonymous letter at the parish office. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Thank you for maintaining the seal, Father. I've confessed again to a different priest, and I trust the sacrament will continue to protect my privacy. She wasn't my last." The message confirmed my worst fears. The killer had continued his murders and felt emboldened by the protection the confessional provided. He was treating the sacrament of reconciliation as a shield for his crimes, confessing to different priests to ensure no single confessor could develop enough information to act while all remained bound by the seal. I reported the letter to police, carefully explaining only that I had received what appeared to be a confession to murder from an anonymous source. The detectives were skeptical. Anonymous letters claiming responsibility for crimes are common enough that police treat them cautiously, but they agreed to review recent suspicious deaths in the region. Over the following months, as I worked with police in my capacity as chaplain, I learned details about several cases that matched the killer's pattern. Deaths initially ruled accidental or natural that, upon closer examination, showed subtle signs of manipulation. But without specific evidence connecting these deaths or identifying a suspect, the investigation made little progress. The moral anguish of this situation has never left me. I possess knowledge of multiple murders. I know the killer is likely still active, and I am bound by sacred vows not to reveal what I know. The seal of confession, which I had always defended as essential to the sacrament's integrity, has become a source of profound moral confusion and spiritual crisis. The theological arguments supporting the seal remain intellectually coherent. If priests could break confidentiality based on the seriousness of confessed sins, the entire sacrament would lose credibility, and countless souls might be prevented from seeking reconciliation with God. The Church's reasoning is that the spiritual good of maintaining the seal outweighs even the temporal harm of allowing crimes to go unpunished. But when I think of Clare Montgomery and the others who died while I possessed knowledge that might have saved them, the theological arguments feel hollow. The seal protected not a penitent seeking genuine forgiveness, but a calculating killer using the sacrament to shield his crimes while maintaining his own twisted sense of spiritual rectitude. The question that haunts me is not whether I made the correct canonical decision. The law is clear and I followed it. The question is whether the law itself is just when it requires silence in the face of ongoing murder. Can a rule, no matter how sacred its origins, be morally binding when following it leads to innocent deaths? I have discussed this case with moral theologians, canon lawyers, and other priests, always carefully maintaining the seal by not revealing identifying details. The consensus is uniform. I had no choice but to remain silent. But several have also acknowledged that the seal of confession represents a tragic conflict between competing moral goods: the spiritual good of the sacrament's integrity versus the temporal good of protecting innocent lives. Some have suggested that the killer's use of confession was so cynical and manipulative that it might not constitute a valid sacrament, potentially releasing me from the seal's requirements. But this argument fails because the validity of confession depends on the penitent's actions and intentions, not on my assessment of them. I cannot declare a confession invalid simply because I find the penitent's motivations disturbing. Others have proposed that I might be morally obligated to break the seal despite the canonical penalties, accepting excommunication as the price of preventing murder. But this position, while emotionally appealing, ignores the broader damage that breaking the seal would cause to the Church's credibility and to the countless people who depend on the sacrament's confidentiality. The case remains unsolved. Police continue investigating suspicious deaths in the region, but without specific leads or clear connections between cases, they have made little progress. I continue working as a chaplain, hoping that my involvement might somehow guide the investigation toward the truth without requiring me to break my vows. But the deepest wound this case has inflicted is spiritual rather than practical. For 23 years, I believed that serving as a priest meant helping people find God's mercy and living according to divine truth. The confession I heard in April 2021 forced me to confront the possibility that religious rules, even sacred ones, can sometimes conflict with basic moral responsibility. The killer has not returned to confess to me, at least not identifiably. But I know from his letter that he continues confessing to other priests, spreading his spiritual burden across multiple confessors while ensuring that no single priest accumulates enough information to act. He has turned the sacrament of reconciliation into a tool for evil while technically maintaining its forms and requirements. This represents a kind of evil that goes beyond simple violence or moral failure. The killer has corrupted the sacred specifically to shield his profane actions, using religious law as a weapon against the very values that law is meant to protect. And the Church's absolute defense of the seal, while theologically consistent, enables this corruption by providing protection that the killer consciously exploits. I no longer know if I made the right choice in maintaining the seal. Canon law is clear, Church teaching is unambiguous, and every theological authority I consulted confirmed that silence was my only option. But Clare Montgomery is still dead, along with others whose names I don't know, but whose deaths I could have prevented if I had been willing to break my vows. The confession I heard on April 17, 2021, remains the most unexplained case of my priesthood, not because of supernatural elements or theological mysteries, but because it revealed an irresolvable conflict between competing moral obligations. Following the rules meant allowing murder, Breaking the rules meant destroying the trust that makes confession possible for countless people seeking genuine spiritual healing. There is no resolution to this dilemma, no satisfying answer that preserves both the seal's integrity and innocent lives. The case continues to haunt me because it demonstrates that sometimes our sacred commitments can become complicit in evil, not through corruption or moral failure, but through rigid adherence to principles that, in extreme cases, serve purposes opposite to their intended aims. I remain a priest, continue hearing confessions, and maintain the seal as church law requires. But I will never again be able to view the confessional as a simple place of spiritual healing and divine mercy. For me, it will always also be the place where I chose canon law over human life, where I maintained religious tradition while a woman was murdered, where sacred vows became chains that bound me to silence while evil continued unimpeded. This is the confession that still haunts me, not the killer's words, but my own silence in response to them.